Hello friends, welcome to my channel and explore the world of Microsoft Azure. My name is Rajneesh Kaushik and I'm a Microsoft certified trainer, consultant and an enterprise architect. For more latest videos and blogs, you can always log into my website rajneeshkaushik.com and subscribe to my blog. Please do not forget to subscribe my channel and click the bell icon so you don't miss the latest videos. Do like, share and comment. Today we will unravel the mysteries of Azure Synapse Networking. We will understand the complex concepts involved in mounting the ADLS Gen tool data lake. How do we create and manage VNet and private endpoints? How do we access the data securely? How do we access the dev, SQL on demand and SQL dedicated pool securely? So let's get started. Demystifying Azure Synapse Networking. Here is the agenda. First, we will understand the um, default deployment of Synapse and how it exposes to the public traffic. Then we will learn about private endpoints with Synapse. We will understand how ADLS Gen 2 can be mounted insecurely, and then how do we secure this ADLS Gen 2. Then we will understand how the Synapse exfiltration protection works and how to enable it. Then we will understand the manage VNet and manage private endpoints in Synapse. Then we will learn the concept of Synapse Privatelink Hub and then Synapse overall architecture, which includes all of these and the points which we have discussed. And then we will jump to a demo where I'm going to show you end-to-end design and development of all these concepts in a single demo. So let's get started. In the default deployment of Synapse, how the Synapse is getting access. Suppose there is a VNet. Inside the VNet you have a virtual machine deployed, and whenever your virtual machine or you are trying to access the Synapse via your user's laptop, how will you access it? You will publicly access this whether you are accessing from the VM deployed in Azure or from your laptop. You will access the private endpoint of the Synapse, and that means the traffic is going outside the VNet to access the Synapse. Okay, so how do we solve this issue? We can solve this issue with the private endpoint. So first let's understand what is private endpoint. Private endpoint is nothing but a network interface that connect you privately and securely to a service powered by the Azure Private Link, which means that a private endpoint is actually uses a private IP address from within your VNet, so that effectively it is bringing that service which is outside your VNet into your VNet, and that means that it is you are accessing the public service via the private IP within your VNet. So every Synapse instance actually have these endpoints. The first is dedicated SQL endpoint, which brings the dedicated SQL pool from the external applications like Power BI, SSMS. They can access this with a dedicated SQL pool. Serverless SQL pool, which is a serverless SQL pool which it brings through via the private endpoint. And then there is a development endpoint which helps you to develop your code like SQL scripts. And then finally the last endpoint is used for Synapse Studio Web UI, so that you can bring the Synapse Web UI inside your VNet and access it. So what does it mean when we say that I'm bringing the private endpoint inside your VNet and giving you a private IP address? Which means that if suppose you have a dedicated SQL pool and you try to access the dedicated SQL pool and then you put a NS lookup, it will actually display the private IP address instead of the public IP address, which means that you are essentially accessing some service via the private IP address within the VNet instead of going publicly and accessing it. So this is how the private endpoint looks like. Now the Synapse is accessed via the private link, and private link actually provides this connectivity, and with the help of private link your private endpoint is created, and this is nothing but a IP address within your VNet, and that VM is accessing the Synapse and Synapse dedicated pool via the private endpoint. So this could be anything like dedicated SQL pool or on demand or dev private endpoint, or your web UI of your Synapse Studio, because you remember there was a fourth one which is for that web UI of the Synapse Studio, which is called Synapse Link. Now let's understand how in a normal setup, when we set up ADLS Gen 2, what are the problems with the normal setup. The normal setup of ADLS, the hacker can come and access the ADLS because it is publicly exposed, and if a VM is trying to access it, it has to go via the public endpoint of ADLS Gen 2 and then access it. So there is a problem with this approach. So you might be thinking that, okay, this is an insecure way. Then now what is the secure way? Secure way to access the ADLS Gen 2 is via the private endpoint. And the private endpoint is exactly the same concept what we discussed in the Synapse case. It is actually a private endpoint created within the VNet for the ADLS Gen 2, so that the connection can happen within the VNet as a private IP address, and then with that private IP address you are accessing the ADLS Gen 2. Now this is okay that ADLS Gen 2 is being accessed by the VM, but how do Synapse access this with the help of private endpoint? Because Synapse is outside, and if Synapse, you need to share this ADLS Gen 2 with Synapse as well, and Synapse should be able to access it directly. So how do we do that? So let's learn that. Okay, so now the $1,000,000 question is how do the Azure Synapse can access it? And as you know, Azure Synapse has a firewall. Whenever you access Azure Synapse, the connectivity goes via firewall. So how do we access the Azure Synapse can access the ADLS Gen 2? So this is the way Azure Synapse can access ADLS Gen 2. Actually, Azure Synapse will access it via the managed private endpoint, and managed private endpoint will have a outbound traffic to ADLS Gen 2, and ADLS Gen 2 will the traffic from Synapse will go via the managed private endpoint, and obviously the ADLS Gen 2 will be accessed via the VM, the way we have already described with the private subnet and a private endpoint. So in order for Synapse to connect to ADLS Gen 2, it will have to create a managed VNet. Managed VNet is a special kind of VNet which is created by Azure, which is outside the scope of a user's intervention. That means user cannot see it and user cannot manage it. It is managed by the Azure Synapse, and inside that it will create a private endpoint. But this is not a normal private endpoint, it is a managed private endpoint, which means that this endpoint can only be created by the Synapse and be used by the Synapse. And with this managed endpoint, it will access the outbound traffic via the outbound traffic. It will go to the ADLS Gen 2. Synapse exfiltration protection. Synapse, whenever Synapse try to access a external URL, suppose example, if you want to fetch a data from New York taxi, and then that data comes from external URL, in that case, would you like to allow Synapse to access anything outside, or you don't want to allow Synapse to access any URL outside URL? So in that case, if you want to protect your system, it is a best practice to protect your system by not allowing it to go to any external URL, and that is what is called Synapse exfiltration protection. So Synapse, when you block Synapse to fetch any external URL, then the solution which is called Synapse exfiltration, that will help you to protect your system and make it more secure. Now you might be thinking, how do I enable this Synapse exfiltration protection? So when you create a Synapse workspace, at that point of time there is an option called allow outbound data traffic only to approved target. If you have put this yes, right, then that means the exfiltration is enabled. If you put it no, then exfiltration is not enabled. So this is another example of Synapse exfiltration protection, where you are allowing Synapse to access the storage account, but you are disallowing the Synapse to access the storage account which is located in a different tenant, in Fabricam tenant. So that way you can disallow the Synapse to access anything outside the storage account which is located in your tenant, and that way you can protect it more. So as we discussed that we will usually create a managed VNet and managed private endpoint at the time of creation of the Synapse workspace. So this is how the overall architecture looks like, right? And this architecture, if you see clearly, there is a managed workspace VNet, and this managed workspace VNet has a managed private endpoints, and these private endpoints are very specifically made for serverless SQL pool, dedicated SQL pool, and then manage private endpoint for storage account. And here we have created a managed private endpoint for two different storage accounts. Here is the first storage account, here is a second storage account. And apart from that, the customer's VNet is there. In customer's VNet, we have created a private endpoint for Synapse Workspace. That means Synapse Workspace means Synapse Studio. So you want to access the Synapse Studio from your VNet instead of going in the public space. And then you also added a dev endpoint, which is for development perspective. You can create a dev endpoint, and this is to why it is used, because you want to make sure that you can submit as jobs to the SQL pool and Spark cluster. So that is why we created this dev endpoint. Similarly, we have a endpoint created for private endpoint, dedicated SQL pool and serverless SQL pool. And obviously we have created a point for PE for storage accounts, two different storage accounts. So which means that within the customer VNet, all the private IP addresses are available which can interact with your Synapse. Not just Synapse, but also ADLS Gen 2, but also your Synapse dedicated and on-demand pools. And that way you are not going outside your VNet to access any of the services. It is readily available to you inside. And this way you can make your system more secure and more foolproof. So make sure that you understand this concept very, very clearly, that managed VNet or managed subnet is not a customer subnet, right? And this managed VNet exposes private endpoints in customer's VNet as needed, which means that this particular managed VNet, they are exposing the private endpoint which is created in the customer space, okay? And they are exposing that to this customer private endpoint. This is why whenever you create a workspace, right, you don't see that managed VNet is created. Managed VNet is automatically created behind the scene, and this VNet belongs to Microsoft and it is managed by Microsoft. It is isolated on its own. That's why it is required private endpoint from the past to be created into it. That is why we require a private endpoint which need to be created from the past service inside this. Now let's understand what is Synapse Privatelink Hub. So whenever you try to connect to Azure Synapse, this is the URL which is being used, web.azuresynapse.net, and this is a public URL, right? And you don't want that you should access the publicly accessible URL. Instead, you want that to create this URL, and you create a private endpoint to this URL so that it is available within your VNet. And that is what exactly we say that Synapse Privatelink Hub. Synapse Privatelink Hub does exactly the same. So here is a Synapse Studio. Here is a private link hub which creates a private connection, and then you can create a private endpoint, and from that private endpoint you can access your dev workspace, Azure Synapse workspace, as if you are accessing it from within the VNet instead of going outside the VNet. Okay, so now what we will do, we will jump to a demo. And before we jump to a demo, let me explain you what kind of subnets I'm going to create, and then that will be easy for you to understand. So here I'm going to create multiple subnets. First is a workstation subnet where I will keep all my virtual machines available, and this workstation subnet will be accessed by a Azure Bastion host where VMs will be kept. So these VMs will not have a public IP address. These VMs will be accessible by the Bastion subnet, which is a Azure Bastion service. Azure Bastion service require a Azure Bastion subnet. That's why this subnet is going to be created. Then for the data lake storage, I am going to create a data store subnet, and then for all the dedicated on-demand pools Along with the Spark pool, I will create an analytics subnet. So these are the subnets which is get created inside a VNet called Corp VNet. You can rename anything, but for the sake of simplicity, I kept it Corp VNet. And why we created these many subnet? Because for each subnet, like for example, Workstation, we will host the Workstation VMs where the developers will come and access the Workstation VM. For data store, the private endpoint for the data lake will be stored. For analytics, private endpoints will be stored in analytics subnet, and then Azure Persistent will host the Azure Persistent. So this is why we have created many subnets. So let's get started and jump to it. Okay, so now we will start creating the VNet first. So first we are going to create a Synapse RG, and inside this Synapse RG we are going to create a VNet for Azure Persistent, and then the name will be Persistent host name as Persistent host, and then I'm making sure that I'm putting a name Corp VNet. You can put any name, and then IP address will be here. I don't want Azure firewall. I want only the Workstation network. IP address is here. I'm going to create multiple subnets as described in the slide. So first will be Workstation subnet. Another one would be data store, which is used for data lake. Another one will be for analytics workloads. And that is it. So now here it says that it has a overlapping address space with other subnet. So what we will do, we will change it. So I have removed the overlapping address space, and I have added 10.8.0.0, and now if you see, these overlapping error is gone. So with this I have created Workstation, Azure Persistent, data store and analytics subnets, and I'm going to go review and create. So now my virtual network along with the subnets are getting created. So let's wait. Now we will go ahead and create a ADLS Gen 2. So create a storage account, create, use the same Synapse RG, advanced, we are going to use hierarchical namespace, which is ADLS Gen 2, and then let's see the name we are giving my secured ADLS networking. We will disable the public access. This is very important. If you don't disable the public access, that means anybody can access it and hacker can access it. So I'm going to add a private endpoint, and name of the private endpoint will be blob PE, and I'm going to put the virtual network name as the same virtual network which we just created, and then subnet name is a data store, and then DNS, private DNS integration is done. Okay. So in this it only allows one private endpoint, but but once the storage account is created, you can add multiple private endpoints. Here we are choosing the default option, review and create. So now deployment is completed successfully. We will go to the resource and then we will go here in networking, and here you will see that private endpoint connection is there. We'll create another private endpoint, and this time I'm going to create a DFS private endpoint, and here you go to the next step, and here we are going to put as a DFS as a sub resource virtual network. We are going to select corp VNet, and here we are going to use data store as a subnet. So this way you can add multiple private endpoints. DNS you will keep it the way it is, tags we will keep it the way it is, and then we will create. So now we have created two private endpoint, one which was created at the time of creation of the ADLS, and second one which we are now creating it. So similarly you can add multiple private endpoints. So this private endpoint will be responsible for accessing the ADLS from the workstation. So now let's go ahead and create a workstation. Okay, so now let's create a VM in the workstation. VM name, I'm going to put this VM in the same resource group, Synapse RG. Putting the name of the VM as VM1, and then I don't want any availability zone option, so no redundancy required. VM name is Windows 11 Pro, and the username I'm putting some username, Azure user, password, my super secret password, and I'm not going to use RDP. You can put RDP, but there is no public IP address, and I am eligible for the licensing. Here I am keeping everything same. Networking. So now I am going to put the workstation as a subnet, and public IP address is none. I am not going to use public IP address. I am going to use private IP address, and in the private IP address I am going to use base station to connect to the VM, and public inbound port none, and let's create it. So then let's go to management, monitoring, tags, review and create, and create. So let it create fully, and we will use Azure base station to log into the VM. Now VM is created, so let's go to the VM, and now we will connect this VM, and it is giving me base station basic or standard, so I'm going to go base station and put my username and password and connect. So the moment I say connect, allow, it will connect here. Now I just want to show you some very important thing here, that when I will connect via the VM, because of the subnets are connected, the traffic between the subnets are allowed, I will be able to access the ADLS Gen 2 contents. But when I will try to access the ADLS Gen 2 content outside the VM, it will not allow me to do that. And this is what exactly I am showing here. So here, if I come here and I go to containers and I try to browse the container, it will say that you are not authorized to perform this operation. But when I go inside the VM, try to access this container, I will be able to access it very easily, because this is the beauty of putting a private endpoint and restricting the person from outside to access the ADLS Gen 2. So let's wait for the VM to log in, and then I will show you this working. So now we are logged into the VM. So now when I log in from outside the VM, you see that you are not authorized to perform this operation. But when I am inside the VM and try to access this same data with the help of containers here, you will see that I am able to access this content. See, even though there is nothing here, but you are able to see nothing is there. You can upload any document here easily. So let me create a file. In the download folder, I am creating a file. And now after that, I am going to upload this file here. And upload. Okay, it shows that I don't have access to that folder. So what I'm going to create, I'm going to create a test container, and I'm going to upload this file in the test container. So I will browse the file and upload it. So successfully uploaded, and it is visible that the test container is visible here. But when I come here and when I try to access it, the test container is also available here, but it does not show me the test container content. But while I am inside the VM, it shows me the test container contents. That means my private endpoint is able to restrict my ADLS account, and it is only accessible from my VM. Okay, so now let's create a VM in the workstation. VM name, I'm going to put this VM in the same resource group, Synapse RG. Putting the name of the VM as VM1, and then I don't want any availability zone option, so no redundancy required. VM name is Windows 11 Pro. And the username, I'm putting some username, Azure user, password, my super secret password. And I'm not going to use RDP. You can put RDP, but there is no public IP address, and I am eligible for the licensing. Here I am keeping everything same. Networking. So now I am going to put the workstation as a subnet, and public IP address is none. I'm not going to use public IP address, I'm going to use private IP address, and in the private IP address I'm going to use base station to connect to the VM. And public inbound port none, and let's create it. So then let's go to management, monitoring, tags, review and create. And create. So let it create fully, and we will use Azure Synapse to log into the VM. Now VM is created, so let's go to the VM, and now we will connect this VM, and it is giving me session basic or standard, so I'm going to go session and put my username and password and connect. So the moment I say connect, allow, it will connect here. Now I just want to show you some very important thing here, that when I will connect via the VM, because of the subnets are connected, the traffic between the subnets are allowed, I will be able to access the ADLS Gen 2 contents. But when I will try to access the ADLS Gen 2 content outside the VM, it will not allow me to do that, and this is what exactly I am showing here. So here, if I come here and I go to containers and I try to browse the container, it will say that you are not authorized to perform this operation. But when I go inside the VM, try to access this container, I will be able to access it very easily, because this is the beauty of putting a private endpoint and restricting the person from outside to access the ADLS Gen 2. So let's wait for the VM to log in, and then I will show you this working. So now we are logged into the VM. So now when I log in from outside the VM, you see that you are not authorized to perform this operation. But when I am inside the VM and try to access this same data with the help of containers here, you will see that I am able to access this content. See, even though there is nothing there, but you are able to see nothing is there. You can upload any document here easily. So let me create a file. In the download folder, I am creating a file. And now after that I am going to upload this file here and upload. Okay, it shows that I don't have access to that folder. So what I am going to create, I am going to create a test container, and I am going to upload this file in the test container. So I will browse the file and upload it. So successfully uploaded, and it is visible that the test container is visible here. But when I come here and when I try to access it, the test container is also available here, but it does not show me the test container content. But while I am inside the VM, it shows me the test container contents. That means my private endpoint is able to restrict my ADLS account, and it is only accessible from my VM. Now I will create a Synapse Analytics workspace. I am going to put resource group as Synapse RG, and then managed resource group it is asking. So I am going to say managed RG Synapse RG. So this is going to create a managed resource group, and workspace name I am going to put Synapse test synapse ws workspace, and it is asking about the which storage account I am going to create. This is not available, so I'm going to put some number here so it is uniquely identified. Now I'm going to put which storage account I can add here. So I'm going to put my secured ADLS storage account, which is already created. File system name, I'm going to put test as a file system name. The test storage is already there. Test container is already created. And it is also telling me that it is going to add a storage blob data contributor role on Synapse for this particular folder. So this is good. Now coming to security, I'm going to put the name of the SQL admin user and its password. You can put use only Azure AD authentication, or you can use both, but okay, so let's make it simplified. I'm putting Azure AD authentication, and then networking is very important. Manage virtual network is enabled, as I explained that manage virtual network will be required. Create manage private endpoint, yes, and here I'm going to put allow outbound data traffic only to approved target, which means that if I put yes, it will do the exfiltration property. So it is just putting yes or no. If you put it yes, it will enable the exfiltration, and then it will ask which Azure AD tenant you can access. If you don't want to put any tenant, then put no. So I'm not putting it yes, but you can put it yes to enable it. Now it is asking about the public network access. So choose whether to permit public network access to your workspace. If you want to put public network access to the workspace, you can put enable, otherwise you can disable it. And when you disable it, it means that publicly you will not be able to access your workspace. Okay, so I am disabling it as of now, and I will put a private access. So this is good. Now let's see, review and create, and let's see if there are other factors which we need to select. Serverless pool cost it is telling, and create. Okay, so now Synapse is already created. Let's go to the resource and see whether we are able to access the Synapse or not. So this is our test Synapse resource, and you can see that managed identity object is created, and SQL admin user is there. The ADLS is my secure ADLS, and let's try to access this. And it also says that there is a SQL pool, built-in SQL pool is there, and let's open it here. Open the studio. It says that it is failed to load because we have restricted this access from this, so that is why it is failed to load. So we cannot access it from outside the VNet. So let's come here again and see how we can enable it. So I will come here again, and first of all I'm going to create a private endpoint connections. So first and foremost, before even we create a private endpoint connection, I will see the SQL pools are there or not. So SQL pool is there, so I am going to create a dedicated SQL pool with a very small value, and the pool name is SQL dedicated, and additional settings, nothing is there, so I'm just going to just keep it the way it is and create it. So now SQL pool is getting created, dedicated pool is getting created. In the meantime, I will go ahead and create a private endpoints. So here is a private endpoints. So first private endpoint I'm going to create for the name of the private endpoint will be on demand PE. That means it is created for the serverless resource. Resource type is Synapse, and here I'm going to create Synapse workspaces, and here it is going to ask about which Synapse workspace, and here it is going to give you SQL on demand, SQL and dev. So I'm going to put SQL on demand. It is going to ask the virtual network. I'm going to select the same virtual network which we have created just now, and in this I'm going to create a analytics. So analytics subnet, I'm going to add this, and the next is integrating with DNS, and tag, no tag, and then review and create. So this is a first one. Similarly, we are going to create another two. So while this is created, I'm going to go ahead and create another one, private endpoint again. So again this will be dedicated private endpoint, SQL dedicated PE. Here I am going to create a Synapse resource, Synapse workspace, and then this is a workspace name, and here I am going to create a SQL. And then similarly it is going to ask the virtual network name. Corp VNet is a virtual network name, and the analytics is a subnet where I am going to create it. It's very quick. Similarly, I am going to create another one which is for dev. Dev is used for development perspective, so I need to create a dev as well. So let's create a dev private endpoint. Private endpoint for dev. Here I am going to say dev PE, and then again resource type is Synapse, and resource is, this is a resource, and here I am going to use targets as a dev. Again virtual network is Corp VNet, and analytics and create. When you created these endpoints, it is showing it here as well. So dedicated SQL endpoint is this, serverless SQL endpoint is this, and development endpoint is this. We are going to copy these three values and use it. Okay, so now our endpoints are created, SQL pools are also created, and obviously you can create many SQL pool of different types and different names. And here you know, I have already created two, so I am not going to create extra one. And then private endpoints are also created. So now let's go to VM and see whether we are able to access the workspace or not. So for that I am coming here again, and then here I am going to go and check whether I am able to access the Synapse workspace or not. Because you saw that from outside I am not able to access the Synapse workspace, but from inside can I access it or not? Let's test it. you are able to access it. And can you also check whether you are able to access your data lake or not? So for that we will come here and see whether our data lake is accessible. Yes, it is accessible. And then it also shows our test which is mounted on the test, and there is a file here in this. So which means that I am able to access the development environment from inside the VM, but from outside I am not able to access it. And let me show you again. From outside I am not able to access it. We have already tested it. So this is my workspace, this is my development environment and Synapse Studio, and when I try to access Synapse Studio, it is not accessible. It is failed. So that shows that we are able to access it from inside the VM but not from outside the VM. So that is good. Okay, so now we will create a Synapse Privatelink Hub. Privatelink Hub. And before we create it, let me show you that whenever you access a Synapse, you use web.azuresynapse.net, and from the VM when I try to access it, it shows that you are using this public IP address for accessing the Synapse in the production environment. But I don't want to go to public IP address. I want that Synapse to be available in the private IP address for me. So for that purpose, I am going to create a Synapse Privatelink Hub. And this is a resource group. I'm going to use the same resource group. And then Privatelink Hub name is my Private Link Hub. Okay. And then create. Okay, I think I missed something. This is not acceptable. Okay. Create. Now this is created very quickly. Now I will come here and then create a private endpoint connection. In this private endpoint connection, I am going to use the name of the PE connection as Private Link Hub PE, and then it is going to ask the which resource name. I am going to put Synapse Privatelink Hub. Which resource? This is the resource, and this is a web. So that means we are going to use this resource, and this is my resource. Now it is asking about the virtual network. I'm going to use my analytics virtual network. And create. So now the private hub and private endpoint is done. Now let's test it from our VM. What is the IP address? Now it is showing the IP address as 10.8.3.7, which means that we are accessing the Synapse with the private IP address instead of the public IP address which it was showing before. Now I will try to access the Synapse SQL tool from my SSMS, and it will not work because even if I try with my credentials, it says that you use this deny public network access is set to yes, and use the private endpoint for inside your virtual network. So if I try to access it from outside the virtual network, this error is thrown. Now if I try to access it from the virtual network where the VM is created, it will work perfectly fine, and I will show you that. So when I access it from inside the VM, you can see that I am able to access it. But when I am trying to access it from outside the VM, I have just shown you the error. This is the error. It says that you cannot access it from outside the VM. So now let's try with another endpoint which is on demand or serverless endpoint. So I'm going to again connect with the serverless endpoint. This time I'm going to use on demand endpoint, and you can see that on demand endpoint is also connected. And if you want to see what kind of IP address is there and what kind of from where I am accessing it, there is a query which you can use. So this query can show you that the client ID, client net IP address and everything, and it shows that local net IP address is this. That means my VM's IP address is this, and I am accessing it from the VM. Now the same query, if I run on the another pool with the new query window, it will show you the client net IP address, which is the IP address of your Synapse, which is a private IP address, private IP address, private endpoint IP address. And the same IP address you will find it when you will use your portal. In portal also you will find the same IP address for the private endpoint, which is here. If you go here, you will find the same IP address. Here is the IP address for on demand. Similarly, the other IP address you can find. So this is for dev. This is for on demand, and this is for SQL dedicated. So for SQL dedicated, this is the IP address. So like that you can verify that which IP address you are connecting. With this we have successfully completed the demo, in which we have created multiple subnets inside a VNet, created a ADLS storage account securely, and storage account is accessed via the private endpoint. Then we created a Synapse workspace with managed VNet and managed private endpoint, and all private endpoints are in the analytics workspace, analytics subnet. We created a VM and access that VM with the Azure Synapse, and then VM is only having access to the data lake as well as to the Synapse, and we are using Azure Synapse for accessing it. We also created a private link hub, and with that we are able to access the web interface of Synapse inside our virtual network. So with this we have completed the demo. Thanks for watching, and do not forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to